Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. So, um, today we are going to be continuing on with McCaffrey's Dragondrums. Sorry, itchy eyes. Uh, so I am just going to continue reading where we left off last chapter. So we did chapter 3. Pimer is a little mad at Melanie for making him ride on a runner beast for 8 hours when he hasn't ridden on one for 5 years. So that's like basically like riding a horse for 8 hours and haven't been on one in ages. He's getting a little bit more used to it. From what it sounds like, he's doing really good with his memorization of the drum beats and messages. Though it sounds like his fellow fellow apprentices are not happy with how fast he's learning them. And we're just going to see where that goes from there. So, oh gosh, my hair is a mess. It's getting a little long, so it's getting a little poofed. So, gosh, I can't think of what to say. So I posted a video a couple of days ago of a trip that my husband and I made to Ramp Rock in Agassiz. And what we're sorry, I actually have a video of the trip all the way up and all the way back, at least through the back roads. I'm going to have to look through the footage, see if it's actually worth watching, because there was a lot of bumping. And I'm going to have to take the audio out, because I know YouTube will boot me out, at least boot that one out for copyright, because we were listening to music all the way out. We had a really good trip, though. Great time together. It was family day up here in Canada, so, or at least in my province. There's a few provinces I don't think that have family day, or they call it something else. Basically, they put a holiday in February to break up the fact that from New Year's to Easter, there's nothing. And it just gives a little bit more of a break to people, which is good. Oh, goodness. So, my ring light broke, well, before I started recording the last episode. But I tempted fate and got it working. However, I don't really feel safe using it anymore. My husband was like, "Oh, we can just use a little electrical tape, cover it over, you can plug it in, it'll turn itself on." I'm like, it doesn't quite work that way. Because I have to press a button to turn it on. If we could set it up the way he thought, that would be fantastic. But I'm not so lucky. If you're wondering, I'm setting up the computer at the same time because I hadn't set it up beforehand. So, we're almost 5 minutes in, and I'm kind of rambling off into nothing. I've got my drink of the day. Today we're doing Fruitio cherry lime. It's very good, actually. Miss Skitter is, well, you can't see her right here, but there you go. There's a Miss Skitter. She's keeping us company. Hi. She's keeping us company without being annoying about it today. She's just making sure she's in, but not in. Alright, so this chapter, chapter 4, I have to chop into two. This is the really, really long 50-page chapter. The rest of them are their normal lengths, about an hour and 20 long. But this one's close to 2.5, 3 hours. So, I'm going to do chapter 4.0 and then chapter 4.5. Like halfway through. I even have it marked so I know where stop, so that it actually seems to cut. It looks like a good breaking spot. Yeah, Liz, stop talking. Hi! Hi. Yeah, she gets confused. Okay. Chapter 4 of Dragondrums by McCaffrey. That day held one more event. At sunset, Pimer was helping the apprentice bring in the miners running from the pasture. He heard the shrill cry of a fire lizard. Glancing up, he saw a slender body, wings back, drop with unnerving speed in his direction. The apprentice dropped to the ground, covering his head with his arms. Pimer braced his legs, but the bronze fire lizard did not come to his shoulder. Instead, Rocky spun around his head, berating him, his jewel-faceted eyes spinning violently red and orange in anger. Sorry, itch. It took Pimer a few minutes to talk Rocky into landing on his shoulder, and even more time to soothe the little creature until his eyes calmed into tones of greeny blue. All the time the miner's apprentice watched, eyes bugged out. There now, Rocky. I'm all right, but I have to stay the night here. I'm all right. You can tell Melanie that you found me, can't you? That I'm all right. Rocky gave a half chirp that sounded so skeptical, Pimer had to laugh. Is that fire lizard yours? Asked the miner curiously as he approached Pimer, eyeing Rocky all the time. No, sir, said Pimer with such chargin that the miner smiled. This is one of Melanie's, Master Robington's journeywoman. His name is Rocky. I help Melanie feed him mornings because she's got 9 and they're all right handful, so he knows me pretty well. I didn't think the creatures had enough sense to find people. Well, sir, I have to say it's the first time it's happened to me, and Pimer couldn't suppress the smug satisfaction he was feeling that Rocky had been able to find him. Now that he's found you, what good will that do? Asked the miner with a reveal of his skepticism. Well, sir, he could go back to Melanie and make her understand that he's seen me. but it would be much more useful if you'd let me have a bit of hide for a message. Tied to his leg, he'll take it back, and they'll know exactly. The miner held up his hand admonishingly. I'd rather nothing in script about the old-timer's visit. Of course not, sir, replied Pimer, offended that he needed to be cautioned. A terse message was all he could scribe on the scrap of hide the miner grudgingly produced for him. The hide was so old, it had been scraped scraped so often for messages, that the ink blurred as he wrote. Safe. Delayed. Then it occurred to him to add in drum measures. Errand completed. Emergency. Old dragon. You're away with the little things, haven't you? Said the miner with reluctant respect as he watched Pimer tying the message to Rocky's leg, an operation the fire lizard oversaw as carefully as the miner. He knows he can trust me, said Pimer. I'd say there were not many, replied the miner in such a dry tone that Pimer stared at him in surprise. No offense meant. Pimer had to concentrate just then on imagining Melanie as strongly as he could in his mind. Then, lifting his hand high, he gave a practiced flick to send Rocky into flight. Go to Melanie, Rocky. Go to Melanie. He and the miner watched until the little fire lizard seemed to disappear in the dimming light to the east. Then the apprentice called them to their meal. As he ate, Pimer wondered what the miner had meant by that remark. Not many that fire lizards could trust? Not many people that trusted Pimer? Why would the miner say such a thing like that? Hadn't he saved the miner's sapphires for them? It wasn't as if he told any lies to do so. Further, he'd never taken any real advantage of his friends in bargaining at a gather or failing to keep a promise. All of his friends came to him for help. And shells! Wasn't the Master Harper entrusting him with this errand? And knowing about Harper Hall's secrets? What had the miner meant? Pimer! Someone shook him by the shoulder. Abruptly, the young Harper realized that he'd been addressed several times. You're a Harper. Can you not give us a song? The eagerness of the request from the men isolated for long periods of time in a lonely hold gave Pimer a genuine pang of regret. Sirs, the reason I'm a messenger is that my voice is changing, and I'm not allowed to sing right now. But, he added, seeing some intense disappointment on every face, that doesn't mean I can't talk them to you. If you'd something I can drum to give the rhythm. After several attempts, he found a saucepan that did not sound too flat, and while the men stomped their feet, boots in time, he talked the newest songs from the Harper Hall, even giving them Dominic's new song about Lessa. The shell knew when they'd hear it sung. though no one was supposed to hear it until Lord Garrosh's feast. If the performance of the spoken song lacked much in Pimer's estimation, Master Shanagar couldn't hear. Dominic would never know, and the men were so grateful that he felt completely justified. He left the mine-hold with the first rays of the sun and made the trip back to the Harper Hall at a downhill pace that all but forced his voice back up to the treble range. At times his runners slithered unnervingly down tracks that they had laboriously climbed the day before. Pimer closed his eyes, held tightly to the saddle pad, and fervently hoped not to go sailing off the track into the deep gorges. When he returned the stolid runner to Bannock, it was barely sweated under the mine strap when Pimer knew that his armpits and back were damp with precipitation. "Safe back, I see," was Bannock's only remark. "He may be slow, but he's sure-footed," said Pimer with such exaggerated relief that Bannock laughed. As Pimer jogged into the Harper Hall court, he heard Tilgin bravely singing his first solo as Lessa. Pimer grinned to himself, for Tilgin's voice sounded tired, even if he was note-wise. None of Melanie's fare was sunning on the ridge, but Zare was sprawled on the ledge of the Harper's window, so Pimer took the steps 2 at a time. Well, he sort of wished someone would encounter him on his triumphant return. He was also relieved that he'd have no temptation to blurt out his adventures. Master Rubbington's greeting, however, was warm enough to make Pimer puff his chest out in pride. "You make the most of your opportunities, young Pimer. But kindly explain your cryptic measures before I burst out with curiosity. Old dragons does mean old timers, I take it." "Yes, sir," and Pimer took the seat the Harper indicated and began. Tron and Verdroth, with 2 blue dragons, came to relieve the miner of his sapphires. "You're positive beyond a doubt that it was Tron and Fidreth?" "Positive. I did see them once or twice before they were exiled. Besides, the miner knew them all too well." The Harper gestured for him to continue, and the day's events made good telling with the best of all audiences in the Master Harper, who listened intently without a single interruption. He then asked Pimer to repeat, this time questioning the detail here, a response there, and extracting from Pimer every nuance of the conversation of miner and old-timer. He laughed appreciatively at Pimer's strategy and lauded his caution of putting the 4 cut gems in his boots. It was only then that Pimer remembered to hand the precious stones to the Harper. The sun sparkled off the facets as the sapphires lay on the table. I'll have a word with Master Nacat myself, and I think I'll see him today, said Robington, holding up one of the gems between thumb and forefinger and squinting at it in the sunlight. Beautiful workmanship, not a flaw. That's what the miners said, and then Pimer daringly added, I gather it's not easy to find the right blue ones for Master Harper's. Master Robington regarded Pimer, a startled expression on his face, which changed to amusement. You will keep that to yourself as well, young man. Pimer nodded solemnly. Of course. If I'd had a fire lizard of my own, you wouldn't have had to worry about me and the stones. And perhaps something could have been done about Tehran. The Harper's face altered, and the flash in his eyes had nothing to do with amusement. Now Pimer couldn't imagine what had prompted him to say such a thing. He didn't even dare look away from the Harper's severe gaze, although he wanted more than anything else to creep away and hide from the master's disapproval. He did stiffen, fully expecting a blow for such impertinence. When you can keep your wits about you as you did yesterday, Pimer, said Master Robington after an indeterminable interval, you prove Melanie's good opinion of your potential. You have also just proved the main criticism that hall masters have expressed. I do not disapprove of ambition, nor the ability to think independently. But, and suddenly his voice lost the cold displeasure, presumption is unforgivable. Presuming to criticize a dragon rider is the most dangerous offense against discretion. Further, and the Harper's finger was raised in warning, you are rushing towards a privilege you have by no means earned. Now off with you to Master Olkey and learn the proper drum measures for Old Timer. The kindly note in his tone was almost too much for Pimer, who could more easily have borne blows and a tirade for his transgressions. He made his way to the door as fast as his laden legs could bear him. Pimer, Robington's voice checked him as he fumbled for the latch. You did handle yourself very well at the mine hold. Only do, and the Harper sounded as resigned as Master Shonagar often had. Do please try to guard your quick tongue. Oh, sir, I'll try as hard as I can. Really, I will. His voice cracked ignominiously, and he spun around the door so that the Harper wouldn't see the tears of shame and relief in his eyes. He stood for a moment in the quiet hall, intensely gratified that it was empty at this time of day, as he conquered dismay at his untimely insolence. The Harper was so right. He had to learn to think before he spoke. He never should have blurted out that unfortunate criticism of dragon riders. He'd have rated a sound beating from any other master. Dominic wouldn't have hesitated a moment, nor even languid Master Shanagar, whose hand he has felt many times for his brashness. But how had he dared to criticize dragon riders, even old-timers, to Master Robbington? Certainly that took prize for impudence, even from him. Pimer shivered and vowed fervently to mind his thoughts, and even more carefully his tongue, particularly now when he did know something of real significance. For he had been aware, previous to his impudent comment, that the appearance of the old-timers at the mine, not to mention their errand, was unwelcome news to the Harper. Besides, what could have been done about the old-timers' illegal return to the north? Pimer gave his ear a clout and made his eyes swim, then started down the corridor. Now, how was he to find out the drum code for old-timers? Under the circumstances, he couldn't just ask Durzin outright without having to explain why he needed to know. Nor could he ask one of the other apprentices. They were annoyed enough with him and his quick studying. There'd be a way, he was sure. Then he wondered why Master Robbington had asked him to find out. Was it a code he'd need? Did that mean the Harper expected this wouldn't be the first such visit by the old-timers? Or what? The speculations on that subject occupied Pimer's mind off and on for the next few days, until he did have the chance to check the code. Somewhat to Pimer's disgust, Durzin treated him as if he had deliberately protracted his errand to avoid polishing the drums. This was his first task, and because Pimer couldn't polish when the drums were in use, it dragged on until the midday meal. That afternoon, Pimer began to participate in other activities of the drum heights, since he had unfortunately learned the drum measures so well. All apprentices were supposed to stop and listen when the messages came in and write down what they heard, if they could. Then Durzin checked their interpretations of the message. It seemed harmless enough, but Pimer soon learned that it was one more road to trouble for him. All drum messages were considered private information. A bit silly to Pimer's way of thinking, since most of the journeymen and all masters had to be adept in drum messages. A full third of the Harper Hall would understand most of a drum message booming across the valley. Nonetheless, if word of something especially sensitive became common knowledge about the hall, it was deemed the fault of the gossipy drum apprentice. Pimer was twigged for that role now. When Durzin first accused him of loose talk a day or two after he started writing messages, he stared in utter astonishment at the journeyman and got a hard clout across his head for it. "Don't you try your ways with me, Pimer. I'm well aware of your tricks." "But, sir, I'm only in the hall at mealtime, and sometimes not even then." "Don't answer back." "But, sir..." Durzin fetched another clout, and Pimer nursed his grievance in silence, rapidly trying to figure out which of the other apprentices was making mischief for him. Probably Clell. And how was he going to stop it? He certainly didn't want Master Robbington to hear such a wretched lie. 2 days later, a rather urgent message from Master Aldive was drummed through from Nabal. Who was on duty, he was dispatched with it to the healer. Mindful of a possible repeat of accusation, Pimer noted that no one was about in the court or hall as he delivered the message. Master Aldive bade him wait for a reply, which he wrote on a then carefully folded sheet. Pimer raced across the empty court, up the stairs to the drum heights, and arrived out of breath, shoving the note into Durzin's hand.
Well, it has gotten a little darker, and Skitter wandered off, and I realized the first 30-some minutes of this video, the cord to the microphone had fallen out of the mic, even though I plugged it into the phone. I'm sorry if the volume's a little bit different. I stopped it so that I could go get a drink, come back, settle in, give my hair a bit of a brush. Didn't work to settle it down. So we're going to just keep moving on. There, still in its original folds, I met no one coming or going. Durzin stared at Pimer, his scowl deepening. "You're being insolent again." He raised his hand. Pimer stepped back deliberately, catching sight of the other apprentices watching the scene with great interest. The especially eager glint in Sel's eyes confirmed Pimer's suspicion. "No, I'm trying to prove to you that I am no blabbermouth, even if I did understand the message. Lord Metron of Nabal is ill and requires Master Aldives urgently. But who'd care if he died after what he's done to Pern?" Pimer knew he merited Durzin's blow then, and didn't duck. "You'll learn to keep a civil tongue in your head, Pimer, or it's back to the runner hold for you. I've a right to defend my honor, and I can." Pimer caught himself just in time before he blurted out that Master Robbington could attest to his discretion. As rife with rumor as the Harper Hall generally was, there hadn't been a whisper about old-timers' raid on the mine. "How?" Durzin's single derisive word told Pimer forcefully how very difficult that would be without being rightfully accused of indiscretion. "I'll figure a way. You'll see." Pimer glared impotently at the delighted grins of the other apprentices. That night, when everyone else slept through the dead hours, Pimer lay awake, restless with agitation. The more he examined his problem, the harder it was to solve it without being indiscreet on some count or another. When he'd still been free to chatter with his friends, he could have asked for help of Brawley, Bonds, Timony, or Ranley. Among them, they'd surely have been able to discover a solution. If he approached Melanie or Sewell about such a piffling problem, they might decide he wasn't the right lad for their needs. They might even consider his complaint a lack of discretion in itself. How right Master Robington had been when he said that Pimer might possibly be plagued into disclosing matters best left unmentioned. Only how could the Harper have known that Pimer was stuck in the one discipline, as a drum apprentice, where he was most likely to be accused of indiscretions? One possibility presented itself to his questioning mind. The apprentices, even Sel, as the oldest, were still plodding through the medium-hard drum measures. Therefore, some parts of every long message reaching the Harper Hall was incomprehensible to them. Now, if Pimer learned drum language beat perfect, he'd understand the messages in full. Not that he'd let Durzen know that when he wrote the message down for him, but he'd keep a private record of everything he translated. Then, the next time there was a rumor of a half-understood message, Pimer would prove to Durzen that he'd known all the message, not just the parts the other apprentices had understood. To further achieve his end, Pimer kept to the drum heights, even at meal times, preferably within the sight of Durzen, the master, or one of the other duty journeymen. If he wasn't near the others, he couldn't be accused of gossiping to them. Even when he was set on message runs, he made the return trip so fast no one could possibly accuse him of dawdling and gossiping on the way. The only other time he was in the court was to help Melanie feed the fire lizards. Messages came through, some of them urgent, some tempting enough. Pimer would have thought for one of the apprentices to repeat, but no whisper of rumor repaid his emulation. In despair, he gave up his plan and tore up the messages he had written, but he still held himself away from others. He wasn't certain how much more of this he could endure when Melanie appeared at the drum heights just after breakfast one morning. "I need a messenger today," she said to Durzen. "Selwood? No, I want Pimer. Now, Melanie, I wouldn't mind letting him go for a minor errand, but Pimer is Master Robington's choice," she said with a shrug, "and he's cleared this with Master Oldkey. Pimer, get your gear together." Pimer bluntly ignored the black looks Sel directed his way, but as he crossed the living room, "Melanie, I think you ought to mention to Master Robington that we haven't found Pimer too reliable." "Pimer? Unreliable?" Pimer had been about to whip around and defy Durzen, but the amused condescension in Melanie's tone was far better defense than any he could muster under his circumstances. In one mild question, Melanie had given Durzen, not to mention Sel and the others, a lot to think about. "Oh, he's been bleating to you, has he?" Pimer could hear the sneer in the journeyman's voice. He took a deep breath and continued to gather his things. "In point in fact," and now Melanie sounded puzzled, "he's not been talkative at all, apart from commenting on the weather and the condition of my fire lizards. Should he have reason to bleat, Durzen?" Pimer half ran back to his room to forestall any explanation by the journeyman. This opportunity was playing beautifully into his hands. "I'm ready to go, Melanie." "Yes, and we have to move fast." It was obvious to Pimer that Melanie had wanted to hear Durzen's reply. "I'll be back to you on this, Durzen. Come on, Pimer." She led the way down the steps at a clatter, and only when they passed the first landing did she turn to him. "What have you been up to, Pimer?" "I haven't been up to anything," he replied with such vehemence that Melanie grinned at him. "That's the trouble." "Your reputation's caught up with you." "More than that, it's being used against me." As much as Pimer wanted to expand, the less he said, he decided. Even to Melanie, the stronger his position. "The other apprentices against you?" "Yes, I saw their expressions." "What did you do to set them so?" "Learn the drum messages too fast is all I can think of." "You sure?" "I'm bloody sure, Melanie. Do you think I'd do anything to get in the Master Harper's bad record?" "No," she said thoughtfully as they skipped down the last flight. "No, you wouldn't. Look, we'll sort it out when we come back. There's a gather today at Ingenhold. Sibyl and I are to be there as Harpers. But Master Robington wants you to play Scruffy Boy Apprentice." "Can I ask why?" Pimer delivered the question on the end of a long-suffering sigh. Melanie laughed and reached out to ruffle his hair. "You can, but I've got no answer. We weren't told either. He just wants you to wander about the gather and listen." "Has he got old-timers on his mind?" Pimer asked as casually as he could. "I'd say he probably does," Melanie answered as an afterthought after a thoughtful moment. "He's been worried. I may be his journeywoman, but I don't always know what's on his mind. Neither does Sibyl." As they reached the archway now and turned towards the gather meadow. "I'm to ride a dragon?" asked Pimer. He lurched to a stop, his eyes bulging out at the scene before him. Bronze Loth was shaking his wings out in the sun, his great jeweled eyes gleaming blue-green as he turned his head to watch the antics of the fire lizards. Dwarfed by his bulk, the tall figure of Natan, fort wear-leader, and Sibyl stood by his shoulder. "Come on, Pimer. We mustn't keep them waiting. The gather at Ingen is already well started." Pimer struggled into his wear-hide jacket making that an excuse for falling behind Melanie. Actually, he was both terrified and overjoyed at the prospect of riding a dragon. All those Claudies up there in the Dragon Heights, he hoped they were watching, that they'd see him riding off on a dragon. Although that teach them to smear his reputation. He pushed from his mind the colliery that privilege of flying dragonback would make his lot with his fellow apprentices that much harder. What mattered was now. Pimer was going to ride a dragon. Natan had always been Pimer's ideal for a dragon rider. Tall, with a really broad set of shoulders, dark brown hair slightly curled from being confined under a riding helmet, an easy, confident air reflected by the direct gaze and a ready smile. The contrast between this present Fort Ware leader and his disgruntled predecessor, Duran, was more vividly apparent as Natan smilingly greeted the Harper's apprentice. "Sorry your voice changed, Pimer. I'd been looking forward to Lord Garrosh's gather and that new saga I've heard so much about from Melanie. Have you ridden dragonback before, Pimer? No? Well, up with you. Melanie, show Pimer the trick." As Pimer attentively watched Melanie grab the riding strap and half walk up Lilith's shoulder, swinging her leg agilely over the last neck ridge, he still couldn't believe his good fortune. He could just imagine Turan permitting a journeyman, much less an apprentice lad, to ride his bronze. "See how it's done? Good. Up with you then, Pimer." Sibyl gave him an initial boost, and Melanie leaned over with a helping hand and a guided rope. It seemed a long way up a dragon's shoulder. Pimer grabbed the rope, and just as he planted his booted foot on Lilith's shoulder, he wondered if he'd hurt the dragon's smooth hide. Natan laughed. "No, you won't hurt Lilith with your boots, but he thanks you for worrying." Pimer was so startled that he almost lost his grip. "Reach up, Pimer," Melanie ordered. "I didn't know he'd hear me," he said in a gasp as he settled astride Lilith's neck. "Dragons hear what they choose to," she said, grinning. "Sit back against me. Sibyl's got to fit in front of you." The words were barely out of her mouth before Sibyl had swung up with the ease of considerable practice and settled himself before Pimer. Natan followed, passing back the riding straps. Pimer thought that a needless caution. His legs were so wedged tightly between Melanie and Sibyl's, he couldn't have moved if he'd had to. Then Sibyl peered over his shoulder at him. "You'll have heard a lot about between, I expect, but I'll warn you now, it's scary, even when you know what to expect." "Right, Pimer," Melanie added, circling his waist with her arms. "I've got you tight, and you hang on to Sibyl's belt." "You won't feel once we're between," Sibyl continued. "There's nothing between. except cold. You won't be able to feel Loth between your legs, nor our legs against yours, nor your hands about my belt. But the sensation lasts only a few heartbeats. They'll sound very loud to you. Just count 'em. We'll be doing the same thing, I assure you. Siebel's grin absolved Pimer from any expression of fear or doubt. Pimer nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He didn't care of what happened between. At least he would have experienced it, which very few apprentice harpers could say. Suddenly, there was a great heave, and he cracked his chin against Siebel's shoulder blade. Inadvertently looking down, he saw the ground moving away from him as Loth sprang skyward. He could feel the great muscles along Loth's neck as the fragile seeming wings took their first all-important down sweep. Then the Gather Meadow and the Harper Hall seemed to rush away, and they were on level with the Hold Fire heights. Siebel gave Pimer's hands, clutching his belt, a warning squeeze. The next heartbeat, and there was nothing but cold, so intense that it was painful. Except that Pimer couldn't feel the pain with his body, only sense that his lack of tactile contact with reality included everything except the wild beating of his heart against his ribcage. Then they were back in the world again, Loth gliding effortlessly down to the right, a tremendous expanse of golden ground beneath his wings. Pimer shuddered again and kept his eyes fixed on Siebel's shoulders. Hard as Pimer wished he wouldn't, Loth continued to glide downward, dipping sideways at unnerving angles. Suddenly, Pimer could hear the fire lizards chattering, and despite his resolve not to look around, found himself watching them zip about the dragon. "It is scary to look down," Melanie's voice said in his ear. "It's worse when they... Ugh!" Pimer felt his stomach drop, and to his horror his seat seemed to leave the dragon's neck. He gasped and clutched more tightly at Siebel, feeling the man's diaphragm muscles move as he chuckled. That's what I mean, said Melanie. Natan says it's only air currents pushing the dragons up or letting them down." "Oh, is that all?" Pimer managed to get the words out in a rush, but his voice betrayed him. "All" came out in a 2-octave crack. Melanie didn't laugh, and he felt more kindly towards her than at any other time in their association. "It always scares me," she said in a comforting shout in his left ear. He was just getting accustomed to this additional hazard of flying dragonback when Loth seemed to be diving straight for the Ingen riverbed. He was pressed back against Melanie and didn't know whether to clutch more fiercely at Siebel's belt or relax into the pressure. "Don't forget to breathe," Melanie was shouting, and at that, he barely heard his words, as the wind ripped sound away. Then Loth leveled and began to circle at a gentler rate of descent towards the now visible rectangle of a gather. To the left was the river and a broad muddy stream between red sandstone banks. Small sailing craft skittered the surface on a current that must be swifter than the turgid surface suggested. To the right was a broad, clean swept rock shelf that led up to Ingen Hold, a safe distance above the highest flood marks left by the river on the sandstone banks. Behind Ingen Hold rose curious wind-fashioned cliffs, some of which made additional holds for Ingen's people, for there were no rows of cot holds adjoining the main hold here. Ingen Hold also had no fire heights, not needing any, since there was nothing but sand and stone around the holds proper, to which thread could do no harm. The lands that supplied Ingen Hold were around the next bend of the river, where the waters had been led inland by canals to supply water grain fields. Pimer wasn't sure that he would like living in such a barren-looking hold, even if no thread could ever attack it. And it was hot. Red dust puffed up as Loth landed, and suddenly Pimer was unbearably warm. He began to unbelt his warehide jacket before he released the riding strap and noticed that Melanie was quick to strip helmet, gloves, and jacket. "I always forget how hot it is at Ingen," she said, fluffing out her hair. "The dragons love it," said Natan, pointing beyond the hold to where the rough shapes that Pimer had assumed were rocks now became recognizable as dragons, stretched out to bake in the sun. It was as he was sliding down Lila's shoulder that Pimer noticed the curious construction of the gather rectangle. There didn't seem to be any walkway. The only open space was the customary central square for dancing. Though who'd have energy to dance in this heat, he didn't know. Then Pimer ducked while Loth showered them all with sand as he vaulted into the air and winged to join the other sunbathing dragons. The fire lizards, Natan's Triss, Siebel's Kimmy, and Melanie's 9, swirled up and away and were met mid-air by other fire lizards, the augmented fair swirling higher and higher in the joy of meeting. "That'll occupy them for a while," said Melanie. Then she turned to Pimer. "Give me your flying gear, and I'll leave it at the hold till you need it again." "We must pay our respects to Lord Laundry and the others," said Siebel, bringing out a handful of marks from his pocket. He presented Pimer with an 1/8 piece and 2 30-seconds. "I'm not being stingy, Pimer, but you'll be questioned if you've had too many marks about you. And I don't think Ingen Hold runs to bubbly pies." "Too hot to eat 'em anywhere." Pimer mopped his sweaty forehead with one hand as he gratefully slid the mark into his pouch. "But they do make a convection of fruits that you might like," said Siebel. "Anyway, move around and listen. Don't get caught being nosy and come up to hold for the evening meal. Ask for Harper Bantor if you have any trouble, or Deese. He remembers you." They had reached the edge of the gather tents, and now Pimer realized that walking space existed, but was considerably covered with tents to deflect the worst of the sun's baking heat. It was simple now for Pimer to move away from the journeyman Harpers and the ware leader in the steady flow of people sauntering past the gather stalls. He saw Melanie turn about, trying to see where he had gotten to. Then Siebel spoke to her, and she shrugged and moved on with him. Almost immediately, Pimer noticed one great difference between this and the gathers he had attended in the West. People took their time. In order to separate himself from his craftmates, Pimer had deliberately lagged behind. But when he would have stepped out again at his customary pace, he hesitated. No one was moving briskly at all. Gestures and voices were languid, smiles slow, and even laughter had a lazy fall. A great many people carried long tubes from which they sipped. Stalls dispensing drinks, chilled water, as well as sliced fruits, were frequently placed and well patronized. About every 10 stalls or so, there were areas where people lounged, either on the sand or on benches placed about the edges. The tenting was raised in corners to catch breezes sweeping up from the river, cooling the lounge areas and the walkway. Pimer did one complete walkabout of the gather rectangle. He could appreciate that, despite the breezeways and the expenditure of minimum of physical effort, people did not do much talking as they strolled from stall to stall. The talking, either conversation or bartering, was done while both parties sat comfortably. So he used one 30-second piece on a long tube of fruit juice and some succulent slices of a rind melon, found himself an inconspicuous spot in one lounge area, and settled to listen as he sipped his drink and ate. At first, he didn't quite catch the softer drawl of these Southeasterners. The low-pitched conversation between two men on his left turned out to be the innocuous boasting of one about the breeding lines of the splay-footed runners he was hoping to barter profitably, while the other man kept extolling the virtues of the currently favored strain. Disgusted at such a waste of his time, Pimer focused his ears on the group of 5 men to the right. They were blaming the weather on thread, the bad crops on the weather, and everything else on the lack of industry, which Pimer thought would be the real problem. A group of women were also murmuring about the weather, their mates, their children, and the neurosity children of others' holds, but all in a fairly comfortable, tolerantly amused fashion. 3 men, with their heads so close together no sound passed their shoulders, finally parted, but not before Pimer saw a small sack pass from one to another and decided they must have only been bargaining hard. The runnermen left, and a new pair took their place, composed their loose robes about them, leaned back, and promptly went to sleep. Pimer found himself growing more heavy-eyed and sipped the last of his juice to keep himself awake, wondering if he could find another lounge area as dull. A combination of excited voices and a chill breeze awoke him. He stared about him, wondering if he missed a drum message, then oriented himself. Night had fallen, and with the set of the sun, the cooler winds of evening blew cheerfully through the raised flaps. There was no one else in the tent with him, but he could smell the aroma of roasting meats and scrambled to his feet. He'd be late at the hold for his supper, and he was hungry. Cool evening had enlivened everyone, for the walkway was now full of quickly stepping, chattering people, and Pimer had to duck and dart his way out of the gathered tents. The dragon lumps on the hold cliff turned their brilliant lanterns of eyes on the doings below them, rivaling the blazing glow baskets set on the high standards about the gather grounds. No one challenged Pimer at the hold courtyard gates, and he found the main hall by simply following the general drift of the well-dressed people. Lord Laundry, according to the Harper Hall gossip, was not a very outgoing man, but at a gather, every holder did make an effort. The principal man and craft masters of his hold were invited with their immediate families to dine in the hold hall, as well as such dragon riders and visiting lord holders, craft masters, and masters who might be attending the gather. By custom, the Harpers ate at the first table below the main one. Pimer had never seen the resident Harper Banter, but hoped that Melanie and Sibyl were already at the table. They were, and chatting in high spirits with Deese, who'd been seconded to Banters the night the Melanie had walked to the table to become a journeywoman, and with Strud, who'd been posted to a sea hold on Ingen River that same night. Gray of hair, but with bright and unusually blue eyes, Banter welcomed Pimer with such a friendliness for a mere apprentice that Pimer was made more uncomfortable by kindness than he would have been by tacticianry. Banter insisted on getting him fresh meats and tubers from one of the drudges, and heaped his plate so high with choice cuts that Pimer's eyes boggled. The other Harpers talked while he ate, and when he was finally swallowing the last morsel, Bantor suggested they all leave to make room for more of Lord Laundry's guests. Then Bantor asked if Pimer would take a Harper's turn on a drum or guitar, and when Pimer saw Sibyl's discreet nod, he agreed with a show of enthusiasm to take a guitar part. "Why, Pimer, I thought for sure you'd take a drum part," said Melanie, her expression bland that he nearly rose to her bait. Pimer restrained an urge to kick her in the shins and smiled sweetly at her instead. You heard today what the drummers think of me, he replied so demurely that Melanie chortled until her eyes filled. As the harpers filed out of the hall for the gather, Siebel fell in step with Pimer. Heard anything interesting? Who talks during the day's heat? Said Pimer with heartfelt disgust. He suspected Siebel had known about the desert daytime indolence. You'll notice the change in them now, and you'll only need to do the dance turns. If I gauge the gather right, said Siebel, glancing ahead at Melanie's slender figure in harper blue, they'll keep her singing until she's hoarse. They always do. Pimer glanced swiftly at Siebel, wondering if the journeyman was aware of his showing feelings for the Harper girl so openly. The first dance turn was the longest and most energetic. The crisp night air stimulated the dancers' gyrations until they were energetic beyond Pimer's credence. Quite a transformation from the languid manners of the afternoon. Then, as Banter, Deese, Strud, and Melanie remained on the platform to sing, Siebel nodded to Pimer to work his way from the square's attentive audience towards the smaller groups of men, drinking tubes in hand, conversing in quieter tones. The subdued level, Pimer decided, was out of courtesy to the singers and their audience, but it only made it hard for him. He was about to give up when the word old-timers caught his ear. He sidled closer to the group, and in the light of the glow baskets recognized two of the sea holders, a miner, a smith, and an ingot holder. I didn't say it was them, but since they've gone south, we've had no more unexpected demands, said the smith. Garnash may also be an old-timer, but he follows Brendan's ways, so it had to have been old-timers. Young Torek often sends his two masters north for trade, said one of the sea holders, in a voice so confidential that Pimer had to strain to catch the words. He always has, and my holder sees no harm in it. Torek's no dragon man, and those that stayed south with him don't fall under Brendan's order. So we trade. He may bargain close, but he pays well. In marks? Asked the ingot holder, surprised. No, barter, gemstones, hides, fruit, such like. And once, here Pimer held his breath for fear of missing the confidential whisper. 9 fire lizard eggs. No! Envy as well as surprised interest was expressed in that startled reply. The sea holder quickly gestured the man to keep his tone down. Of course, there was no distinguishing the bitter jealousy. They've all the sand beaches in the world to search in the south. Any chance? The fascinating conversation broke off as another sea holder joined them, an older man and possibly superior to the gossiping seamen. The talk turned to other things, and Pimer moved on. Then Melanie began to sing alone. The other harpers accompanying her. All conversations died as she sang, with what appeared to Pimer to be an incredible aptness to the fire lizard song. Her voice was richer now. Pimer noticed with a critical ear, the tone better sustained. He couldn't fault her musical phrasing, nor should he be able to after 3 turns of severe instruction by Master Shanagar. Her voice was so admirably suited to the songs she sang, he thought, and more expressive than many singers who had even better natural voices. As often as Pimer had heard the fire lizard song, he found himself listening as intently as ever. When the song ended, he applauded so vigorously as everyone else, only then aware that he had been equally captivated. Putting words to music was not Melanie's only talent. She put her music in the hearts and minds of her listeners, too. Well, her enrapt audience started shouting for the favorite tunes. She beckoned Siebel to the platform, and they sang a duet of an Eastern Sea-Old song. Their voices so well blended that Pimer's respect and admiration for his fellow harpers reached unprecedented heights. Now, if only his voice turned tenor, he might have the chance to sing with. He played 3 more dance turns, but Siebel had been correct. The Ingen gathers wanted Melanie whenever she would favor them with song. Pimer noticed that for every solo she sang, there was at least 1 group song and a duet including the Ingen harpers. Clever of her to forestall ill feelings. Too bad such discretion did not translate into his particular problem with the drum apprentices. Whether it was because he had to sleep in the afternoon, or because the desert air was particularly bracing, Pimer was never sure, but it was only when he noticed the thinning of the crowd around the dance area and the increased number of people rolled up in their blankets in the gather tents that he began to feel fatigue. He looked around then for Siebel and Melanie. When he saw nothing of them, he finally sought a weary, yawning Strud, who advised him with a grin to find a corner and get some sleep, if he could. It had been easy enough to sleep that afternoon, but now, with no heat to lull him and the things he had heard, music as well as malice, danced about in his mind. One positive fact emerged. The old-timer's descent on the miner in the Fort Hold was not an isolated incident. He also knew that while Ganache, Ingen's old-time were-leader, was respected, Ingen holders would have given much to be beholden to Bendon instead. And that is as far as I'm going to go in this chapter for today. We will get the other half in just a few days. And then we'll just do it chapter by chapter. We don't have to cut it up like this again. Well, sounds like Pimer had fun at the gather. Or at least doing his job at the gather. And of course, a good afternoon nap feels good too. Yeah, you can see how it's getting really dark in here. Normally I would have my ring light right here, which would be shining light here, so that when the sun starts going down, it's not so bad. Well, that is, I'm gonna say that's the end of this chapter, or end of this for today. I really don't have a lot of end comments. As you can see, Skitter never did come back. She enjoyed her wander, and I think she's asleep over on the bed right now. Yeah, she is. She's got a special spot. She loves to sleep, and I don't blame her. It's a good thing. So I work the next 2 days. I'm going to edit this probably tonight and tomorrow. I'll do more recording in a couple of days, get the next chapter done, so we won't fall behind again. I still have another chapter of the Sword of Shannara to edit as well. So, excuse me. There's quite a bit that I have at least 2 videos, right? Well, 3 because one, Shannara is waiting to come out in a few days, or tomorrow. I don't know if today's the 21st, so it'll come out on the 22nd. I'm gonna go back to the 4-day posting, so this will come out on the 24th. Just because it's easier to keep to the 4-day schedule than to try and play catch up. I want to thank you guys for your time today. Really appreciate it. If you want to, please leave a like, comment, and if you feel really generous, subscribe. But even if you don't, I just want to say thank you, and I wish you all a great good morning, evening, night, whatever it is for you right now. Have a great one. I do appreciate y'all. Have a great bye-bye.